At exactly 4 in the morning, the sky above Tehran lit up not with the glow of sunrise, but with explosions. Sirens screamed, children clung to their parents, and the world once again found itself watching war unfold in real time. Israel had launched a preemptive strike, the Operation Swift. Overwhelming, targeted Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Drones swarmed, warplanes roared. Within hours, entire research facilities were reduced to smoke and silence. Dozens of high-ranking officials were declared dead. Iran responded with a barrage of drones, most intercepted, but the message was clear. Age of restraint had ended. Thousands of kilometers away in the heart of West Africa, another leader was already awake, not because of war, but because in his country the threat of war never sleeps. His name is Ibrahim. His nation has no nuclear program, no ballistic missiles, and no seat at the table where the rules of global power are written. And yet he understands exactly what just happened when a powerful country decides it no longer needs permission. When the balance of fear replaces the balance of law, the consequences echo far beyond the battlefield. Ibrahim does not take sides, but he does raise question: what kind of world are we building where peace can be broken without warning, and sovereignty is a privilege, not a right? This is not just about Iran or Israel. This is about every small nation watching quietly, wondering if this is how the world now resolves its fears. Who will be next? In early hours of a quiet Thursday morning, the world was jolted by breaking news. Israel had launched a full-scale military operation against Iran. The operation, later confirmed as Rising Lion, was the largest direct offensive between the two countries in decades. Its target, Iran's nuclear infrastructure. The operation began with a series of precise air strikes. Fighter jets flew deep into Iranian airspace, striking key nuclear research sites, including those in Natanz and Isfahan. Satellite images, released hours later, showed craters where once stood reinforced underground facilities. Videos posted online by citizens in Iran captured fireballs erupting across the night sky, the deafening sound of impact echoing through residential neighborhoods. According to official military briefings, the strikes were coordinated to dismantle the core of Iran's suspected weapons program. Multiple military installations were hit, communications networks were disrupted within the first 6 hours. Dozens of strategic targets were reportedly neutralized. The Iranian government responded swiftly. State television denounced the attack as an act of aggression and vowed retaliation within the days. Hundreds of drones were launched toward Israeli airspace. Most were intercepted before reaching their targets. Still, both nations had crossed a threshold from words and warnings to action and bloodshed across international media. The phrase game-changing began circulating. Analysts described operation as not only a direct confrontation between two longtime adversaries, but also a shift in global military doctrine. Israel had acted alone without waiting for international consensus. No vote, no sanction, just action in West Africa. Ibrahim followed the situation closely. He was not surprised by the speed nor the intensity. What struck him was the silence from the institutions that claimed to uphold peace, silence from voices that once urged diplomacy. The world, it seemed, was watching through a window without stepping into. Ibrahim, this was more than a conflict between two nations. It was a message that force, when used with certainty, might override law, a message that powerful nations can still act as if they are above the framework they helped build. What concerned him most wasn't the scale of destruction, it was the precedent. If one country can strike another unprovoked by direct attacks, citing only national security and perceived future threats, then what stands between any nation and a similar fate in this rising storm? Ibrahim understood something clearly. This was not just a Middle Eastern crisis. This was a global signal, and small nations like his own should take notice. The motivations behind the operation were both explicit and implicit. Publicly, Israel cited national security concerns, pointing to recent developments in Iran's nuclear program as a red line crossed. Intelligence reports, some leaked, others officially acknowledged, had pointed to new levels of uranium enrichment, advanced missile testing, and the movement of high-ranking personnel to fortified locations. But beyond the headlines, Ibrahim saw something deeper. He saw a nation acting not from desperation, but from calculated strategy. The operation was not a spontaneous decision. It had been prepared over months, possibly years. The timing, immediately after a diplomatic deadline expired, was intentional. It was a message not only to Iran, but to every nation watching security in this new world, is something you take, not something you ask. For the global response was uneven in Western capitals. There was no immediate condemnation. Statements were cautious. Some called for de-escalation, others said nothing at all. The silence spoke volumes. It revealed a reality that Ibrahim had long suspected. International law is only as strong as the political will behind it, and in this case will was replaced by calculation. The United Nations held an emergency session. Debates were held, cameras rolled, but no meaningful resolution was passed, no binding action, no protective measure for the civilians caught in the crossfire. As Ibrahim watched the proceedings, he couldn't help but think, what is the value of diplomacy if it never dares to confront power? More alarming than silence was normalization. Military analysts and media outlets began treating the strike as a strategic reset, a necessary adjustment to restore balance, as if launching missiles on foreign soil was now a legitimate tool of negotiation. Ibrahim knew that if this framework became accepted, the consequences would stretch far beyond Iran or Israel. It would set a precedent that preemptive force executed unilaterally is not only allowed but respected. This new doctrine, he feared, would be applied elsewhere to countries without nuclear programs, to governments unwilling to conform to leaders who challenged the global order, not with armies, but with ideas. Ibrahim understood that his country was not on anyone's radar yet, but he also knew that silence now could be seen as consent later. What concerned him most was not the missiles themselves, but the moral collapse they represented, the erosion of restraint, the disappearance of process, and the quiet acceptance by those who once claimed to protect peace for small nations. The lesson was clear: alliances may shift, institutions may fail, but sovereignty must be defended first in principle, then in practice. Inside Iran, the aftermath of the strikes unfolded in waves. First fear, then silence. In cities like Tehran, people flooded supermarkets, pulled their children from schools, and huddled indoors as the news spread. The initial instinct was survival, emergency. Sirens blared, social media went dark in some areas, and then something unexpected happened. There was no large-scale protest, no calls for revenge from the streets, just quiet. That silence was not apathy. It was layered with something more complicated: fatigue, disillusionment, and in some cases, quiet relief. For years, people had been told that nuclear advancement was a matter of national pride, but now, as missiles rained down, many began to question, what had all that secrecy, all that defiance truly gained them? Ibrahim paid close attention to these subtle shifts, not through official broadcasts, but through the spaces between words, the tones of unofficial recordings, the hesitation in voices that once shouted slogans. Something was changing inside Iran, not only in infrastructure, but in perception. There were reports, unconfirmed but persistent, that some officials had gone into hiding, that key facilities had been evacuated days earlier, that warnings were ignored. For Ibrahim, these were signs of erosion, not just of military readiness, but of internal cohesion. This wasn't merely a tactical failure. It was a fracture in confidence. More telling was the response from the political class. Statements were defiant, but lacked the usual unity. Some called for retaliation, others spoke vaguely of measured responses. It was as if even within the upper echelons of power, there was uncertainty about what came next, and about who, if anyone, still held control. Ibrahim knew that wars are not only won or lost on battlefields. They are decided in the minds of populations. If a government loses the confidence of its own people, even in silence, it begins to fall. He also understood the danger of underestimating quiet populations. Silence can precede transformation. A people stripped of fear may at last confront the very structures that kept them silent. From West Africa, Ibrahim watched not with glee, but with gravity. He saw in Iran a mirror not of military power, but of the fragility of trust between rulers and the ruled. To him, what unfolded was not just a national crisis. It was a case study, a lesson to any leadership that hides truth behind slogans, that builds secrecy instead of consensus, and that assumes the people will always remain passive. Iran had not collapsed, but something fundamental had cracked, and once trust is fractured, it does not return on command. While missiles exploded in the skies over Iran, a different kind of war was unfolding in West Africa. No sirens, no bomb craters, no dramatic footage for global news channels. But for Ibrahim, The threat was just as real, perhaps even more insidious. Burkina Faso was not being attacked by aircraft, it was being eroded by shadows. There were no fighter jets. Instead, there were briefcases, contracts, encrypted messages, shifting loyalties. The instruments of this war did not make noise, they moved silently through banking systems, backdoor diplomacy, and disinformation campaigns. Ibrahim had seen it all. He had watched how entire media narratives were bought and sold, how protests appeared overnight with banners printed abroad, how armed groups seemed to receive supplies from nowhere and disappear just as easily. He had seen political alliances shift, not because of conviction, but because of money wired at midnight from an untraceable account. And yet, when his government confronted these actions, the world called for dialogue. When he demanded accountability, they called for restraint. When he exposed foreign interference, they called him radical. To Ibrahim, it was clear there was a double standard. A nation that launches drones is seen as bold. A nation that resists manipulation is seen as dangerous. This, he believed, was the new colonialism, not carried out by armies, but by influence, not enforced through invasion, but through silence. Burkina Faso, like many African nations, stood at the crossroads of this quiet conflict. Its resources were sought, its people underestimated, and its sovereignty negotiable, at least in the eyes of others. Ibrahim had refused to play along. He had changed military codes, overnight replaced entire chains of command, cut off ties with those who pretended to be partners, but acted as saboteurs. He had called out institutions that once dictated financial dependence. He had warned the people that their greatest enemy might not arrive in uniform, but in a suit. These were not paranoid measures, they were survival strategies, because in today's world sovereignty is not lost in a single day. It is chipped away policy by policy, compromise by compromise, until a nation wakes up and finds that its decisions are no longer its own. Ibrahim understood that his country's fight was not unique. What made it urgent was that few were watching, and those who did often watched with the wrong lens. So while missiles drew headlines elsewhere, remained focused on protecting the quiet front lines, the ones that determined whether a country could still speak with its own voice in this invisible war. There were no dramatic explosions, but there were casualties. Trust, unity, truth, and those Ibrahim believed were far more difficult to rebuild. Peace is often portrayed as the absence of war, but for Ibrahim that definition had become dangerously outdated in today's world. Peace without justice is simply delay. It is the calm before the storm, and silence, especially from those who have the means to speak, is not neutrality, it is complicity. World watched as cities were bombed, as families were torn apart, and as international law was quietly set aside, and yet many said nothing. They called it strategy, self-defense, or worse, inevitable. But Ibrahim refused to accept inevitability as policy. He believed that small nations had the right question power, that silence was not safety, that obedience was not peace. He had seen first and how silence allowed outside actors to influence elections, how silence let international institutions enforce rules selectively, how silence allowed narratives to be crafted without the voices of those most affected. And so he chose to speak, not in condemnation, not to take sides, but to remind the world that when you normalize silence in the face of injustice, you create the conditions for chaos, because when powerful countries redraw the map with missiles, smaller ones begin to question whether dialogue is worth pursuing. When diplomacy is ignored, when preemptive strikes become templates, then every nation must ask itself, what are we building? Ibrahim's answer was clear. He did not believe in peace through fear. He did not believe in peace through silence. He believed in peace through balance, where no country, however small, must beg to exist. He called on regional alliances to reaffirm the value of mutual respect. He encouraged young nations to invest not just in defense, but in dignity. He reminded the world that peace is not kept by silence. It is maintained by courage, courage to speak when others are quiet, courage to uphold principles, even when they are unpopular, courage to believe that justice, not force, is the true foundation of stability. To Ibrahim, the danger was not war alone. The true threat was a world that learned to accept war as a natural consequence of fear. He believed that fear should never be policy, that preemption should never become precedent, and that power unchecked was just another form of oppression. In that spirit, he did not ask for sympathy, he demanded clarity, because silence, though quiet, is never neutral. It always serves someone. and in this new age where decisions are made faster than votes can be cast, he urged every citizen, every leader, and every institution to remember one thing: a peace built on silence will always collapse beneath the first whisper of truth in the aftermath of war. There is always a temptation to move on quickly, to call it a lesson learned, to file it under history, and return to business as usual. But Ibrahim believed that this moment demanded more. It was not just a headline to scroll past, it was a warning, a crack in the foundation of how the world understands peace, power, and justice. He called on the international community not to take sides, but to take responsibility, because what happened in the skies above Iran could become a model repeated elsewhere, unless global conscience wakes up. He reminded leaders that silence has a long shadow, that ignoring one breach opens the door to others, and that the principle of sovereignty, once undermined in one part of the world, soon loses value everywhere. For small nations like his, the stakes are even higher. Cannot rely on alliances that shift with political winds. They cannot afford to wait for distant powers to protect their interests. They must stand not in defiance, but in clarity, not with aggression, but with conviction. Ibrahim urged citizens across the global south to pay attention not just to the noise of war, but to the quiet erosion of dignity, the sanctions that suffocate, the debts that bind, the narratives that rewrite truth. He called on the youth to learn not only history, but strategy, to understand the weapons of today are not always made of metal. Some are made of lies, distractions, and silence. And he spoke directly to those who still believe in justice. If you watch cities burn in silence, ask yourself, why? If you saw missiles replace dialogue, ask yourself, what comes next? And if you live in a place where power is taken for granted, remember, not everyone has that luxury. Ibrahim closed his address not with fear, but with resolve. He knew that Burkina Faso could not stop wars between great powers, but it could refuse to mimic them. It could chart a different path, one built on transparency, resilience, and principle. He knew that people remember acts of war, but they are shaped by acts of courage, and so he left his people and the world with one message: do not confuse quiet with peace, do not mistake restraint for weakness, and do not assume that history will always repeat itself, because sometimes in the most unlikely corners of the world, a different kind of future is being written by those who refuse to stay silent.